It's a great pleasure for me to show you the results of the third Prowein business report. And again, that is only possible because two strong partners, Prowein and Geisenheim University, joined forces. And I very welcome everyone in the room for this report, but also everyone outside who's joining us for the webinar. Thank you very much for your interest. I think it will be interesting results we can show you in the next 20 minutes. We asked, again, producers and visitors from Prowein about the economic condition, but this year was the special topic climate change. And we had a couple of questions we wanted to know. Well, everyone talks about climate change, particularly after 2018. And we really wanted to know, well, how important is climate change to the wine industry compared to all the other threats and challenges the industry faces? The second thing we wanted to know is, well, who actually already experienced something about climate change? Over the last 5 years, we asked, what did you experience and how strong was the impact? If you look in the past, then it's also very important to look in the future. And what we heard this morning is that the future is only coming and there will be many challenges for us when the temperature starts to increase further and we see more variability. So we asked the industry for the next 10 years, what do you expect and how strong will the effects will be for you? And again, 10 years for us seems to be a long time, but in viticulture, it's only a third of the time you have a vineyard. So it's actually a very short snapshot what's going to happen. Well, if things change, there's a human tendency to react. So we also asked the industry, what did you already do? How did you adopt? But also what do you expect to do in the future? So that's the fourth point. And the final and most important one is about sustainability. We heard about today, we will only survive and there will be no sixth extinction if we actually change the way we consume, the way we work, and if we stop to emit carbon. So that's basically the question, well, what does the industry think about sustainability? We were really lucky because we received very strong support from those visiting and exhibiting at Prowein. So we had again 1,445 participants from more than 40 countries. We are unique in the world because we can cover the whole supply chain from the producers, those in the middle, exporters, importers, and the retailers selling the wine to the final consumers. If you look at those on the production side, we have more than 30 countries. Of course, those in the traditional world in Europe are in the majority, but we have participants from the New World and from other European countries, so really covering a large share of the wine globe. If you look at those on the in the middle and on the consumer side, we have again more than 30 countries with a big share in Central Europe, but also Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and North America. Threats and challenges. We gave the industry a number of threats and challenges they told us about that are important to them. And we wanted to know, well, first, how strong do you affect the impact in the next few years, but also how likely do you expect things to happen? And what we see here is, well, the number two most important ones at the moment are the industry is worried about health policy. So in the sense of, well, it's getting more tight, more regulated to sell wines. There might be pricing minimums, there might be higher taxes. Then the next one, of course, we are actually in a cooling climate and not in the temperature-wise, but from the economy. So we see that we are not in a recession yet, but the markets are actually more on the downside at the moment. And that, of course, affects how much wine the industry can sell. If you look at number 3, that's already where we are, climate change. So 50% of our participants say, well, for us, climate change will have a strong or very strong impact in the next years. If you remember last year's report where we had, for instance, Brexit, only 22% of the respondents really were worrying about the unregulated Brexit, because that's now a never-ending story. And at some point in time, you made your homework and you will be prepared for it. Well, of course, the next one is health policy, international trade wars, competition through spirits and craft beer, but climate change is the number 3. And when asked about how likely do you expect this to happen, 3 out of 4 told us, well, there is a very high likelihood that we will see in our business an effect from climate change. So it's really the majority. If you look in the past, what have the businesses expected and who was already affected? And what we can see here is there's a very clear pattern. If we start here from the small wineries and the cooperatives, these are the two who actually produce grapes and who produce wine. And here, 9 out of 10 told us, yeah, in the last 5 years, we've seen effects. If you then go further down the supply chain, these effects decrease. So the large wineries who basically buy grapes and they buy wine, here only 3 out of 4 told us, yeah, we've seen an effect. If you then go further, the exporters, who are basically the translators between the markets, 70% told us that there have been an effect. And if you go further down to retail, on-trade and wholesales, about 6 out of 10. And that's a classical pattern. And the reason basically is those here, they see the direct climatic effects, but they cannot really deviate. You cannot take your vineyard and move to Scandinavia. You cannot take your soil and your plants. You are stuck with your soil and your property. So those strongest affected, they can less deviate than those here. Well, for the wholesale and special retail, if you can't get a wine anymore from southern Spain, well, then you might buy one from UK at one day. So they are much more flexible and basically to react. In the future and now, we will look at the different effects starting from grape production to the consumer. And this is actually how the supply chain goes. So who was affected in grape production? What did we see here? Which effect did we see on an enology side? And what we'll see is variation. Things change. The business doesn't really like things to change because it's a fine-tuned business. We only harvest once, on a global scale twice a year. Northern and Southern Hemisphere. But we are really challenged by producing wine so the consumer can drink it every day. The consumer doesn't only drink wine once when it's harvested. So there is a smoothing, a buffering mechanism over the whole supply chain. And if things change and get more variable, then there is risk. And risk means people start to do their business differently. They start to deviate, they start to collaborate, and we will look at that. And this is unfortunately not the end to it, because not only production is affected by climate change, but also the person here in the end, the consumer. And we will also look at top-down effects from how consumers' changes will have to come down and how the industry will have to mitigate that. So it's a second challenge. Well, if you start at the viticulture part, and where we see here is that about 6 out of 10 tell us, well, there have been extreme weather events. We've seen picture this morning from extreme rain events. You heard about early frost. We know about other hail storms where basically suddenly the vintage looks good, but there is a sudden event and it's all gone, or half of it is gone. Then, of course, we have increased volatility of grape yields. Because if there's 1 year where you have a late frost and the next year the plant basically survives and it compensates for that, and there is suddenly a very large yield. But as we heard is, well, wine cannot be really stored for many years. So you have to kind of live with what you have within 1 year. And we've seen in 2017, there was a year where many big producing countries have been suffering a lot from very heat, but also from late frosts. And it was the very first time where we had less production than we actually had consumption. This third one is really about, well, we haven't enough water. What we just heard from Australia is it is not enough what we get down in precipitation. We need actually to irrigate, or we would need to irrigate if we could. And that is actually also decreasing our yields, or it's affecting how the wine tastes. If you go on further down, is that what we also heard from Australia is, well, in the old days in Germany, you started to harvest your wine in October, and then it went up to November. Now it starts in August, and then in the middle of September we might be finished. And it's much more denser and much more tighter, and you have to have all your capacities ready for it to basically take on, but also produce the wine within a shorter period of time. And then smaller points, phytosanitary plant protection, and look at that, other grape necessary in the last 5 years, 1 out of 5 told us this, yeah? And we will look at this in the future. If you go further down, well, if the grapes change, then of course we wouldn't be surprised that the wine changes. And what we see here is that particularly the large wineries, those taking on multiple different lots, bits and pieces from different producers, and those who have the challenge to produce mainly a uniform wine for the consumer, to sell it through the supermarkets, they are basically selling us, well, yeah, the sensory characteristics change, and we did need new technology to basically cater for it and try to compensate as best as we can. That was quite interesting for us that the small producers did not realize this as much. And parts of it is because they have direct contact to the consumers. So they have the cellar door sales where they can better communicate this. Whereas these guys here in the middle, they are under pressure from the retailers who basically say, well, you know, you have to give us a product that tastes the same every year. What we see now is volatility, and no one really likes risk and volatility because it changes the business. And this is what we see. Well, the volatility of availability increased. 2017, the first time at the bulk wine fair where the people were trying to get as best as they can wine to sell. They couldn't get it. And that was again where new players came in the game, like Eastern Europe, because the other countries could not deliver. What we also see as well, as soon as availability changes, what reacts very strong? Price. If something gets scarce, then the price goes up extremely, where only those benefit who can deliver. And if, like last year, 2018, we had the largest harvest in 20 years globally, then the prices go down very much. And those who finally can deliver don't earn. So we have availability of goods change, the grapes and prices, and the wine quality. And again, the large wineries are those who were strongly affected so far, whereas this was buffered to the exporters and retailers, and the retailers didn't realize it so far yet. If you go down for the wine quality, again, the smaller ones surprisingly told us there wasn't very much going on. Whereas the prices, everyone is almost on the same level, saying every second person, yes, we've seen a volatility increase in prices. And that's again something, you cannot really change the price of your wine in the supermarket. As soon as you do that, as soon as you increase, the consumers stop buying quite drastically. And as soon as there's an oversupply, there will be a price war and the prices go down quite a lot. Well, what does this mean? As soon as you can't get the wine you want, well, what do? You try to build a collaboration. You try to secure the harvest for the next year, or you realize, well, I can't get it from the sources I had last year. I need to look for a new source. So that's what we see already now, is that they say, well, we had to have a closer collaboration. We have to keep those closer at hand and to see, can we get the wine this year or not? And maybe we can have long-term contracts, something that's very unusual in the bulk wine business. And again, we see here that people look for other suppliers to basically fulfill the needs they have coming down from the retailer side. And this is interesting. The retail side basically said, well, we didn't have to switch so far yet. We are still fine with our suppliers. We are still fine with our origins. Nothing much happened so far. Profitability was also mentioned in Australia as so far there are losers and winners. So far there are still companies, if you look for instance more in the north, well, we had better climates over the last years. It was warmer, we had more riper fruit, like in the 60s you couldn't have a ripe wine in the Mosel Valley. That is possible right now. And so we see here now about half is not affected, a third has a negative profitability, and about a quarter says, well, I actually gained from it. Looking in the future, particularly those for whom profitability is key, the large bottlers and the cooperative, more than half expect profitability will decrease in the next 10 years. But to be able to adapt, to be able to have investments into new measures, what you need cash, you need investments. You need to be profitable to do that. So let's look in the future. We asked the industry about what do you expect for the next 10 years? And again, we looked first at viticulture. And also we asked first, well, everyone, who do you expect, who will bear the biggest challenge? Who will be affected strongest? And here we can clearly see this fits with what we've already had, that those producing grapes, 50% everyone said, yeah, these will be absolutely affected. Then it's going down because these guys here, they can deviate. For them, a fine wine retailer in Düsseldorf, they can also cater wine or get wine from somewhere else and just put it on their list. If you now look into grape production, what are the expected effects for the next 10 years? And there's one significant increase, and that's here that now 1 in 3 says we need different grape varieties. We have to change our wines because they are not adapted well anymore to the climate we are facing. And then there is a little change here in phytosanitary plant protection, which might be surprising, but variability basically means there can be now a wet summer in Italy, something that was not very usual before. And they have now challenges with phytosanitary actions they did not have for the last decades. That is surprising that the industry says, well, we've already seen the biggest effect up here. We've already seen the biggest effect on extreme weather events. We've seen the biggest effects on volatility. But actually, Claudia Kammann believes that they are underestimating the effects of the accelerating climate change. So there might be actually a downside here that we might see more than the industry actually expect at the moment. On the enology side, we see one big effect for the future, and this is while in the past, only the large wineries were seeing, yeah, we need new enology tools, we need new methods to change the wine. Now this also takes place in the smaller wineries and the cooperatives. They also have to invest in that, and that's for them much harder, because unfortunately, harvest is only once. And you only make wine in October and November. To actually repay this all equipment, this new equipment, usually you have many decades for this. And this might not have been planned now. But for a large winery, the profitability is not a key because they are doing this all year over. If you look at the sensor characteristics, again, there is no strong increase expected that this will change, basically because the industry expects this to mitigate it on a technology basis. So we will use new enology measures to basically try to keep the sensory properties we had so far. On the risk level, remember this is what we had before. The largest risk was taken in the middle of the chain, and the end didn't see very much yet. It was buffered in the middle by the players, the large bottlers. And what the industry expects is basically, well, it will travel down the chain. Those, in the end, there's a 30% increase saying, retailers, oh yeah, we've seen this, the bottlers were hit, this will come to us. We will see volatility and availability of goods, and this is increasing everywhere to quite strong extent. If you look at the availability, the price change, again, the retailers, 70% say, yeah, we are expecting a strong change in the variability of prices, and this is so far very hard to basically tell this to consumers. In the wine quality, we don't see a strong increase except for the exporters, because that is, again, the hope that enology hopefully will help us. But we've also heard from Australia, still in some years' time, we will produce wines that are flavorful but has less alcohol than before. How will the industry interact with each other? And we've seen before they already started to deviate and to collaborate, but there's a strong increase on the retailer side. They say, well, we are expecting that we might have to shift to other countries. We have to shift to other producers and to other suppliers. And this is something that will affect the producers more than they expect right now. Because, they expect, well, I will still be able to deliver. It might just be more risky, it might be more costly, but he doesn't have it on the chart that maybe he already went somewhere else and gets his wine somewhere else. So this will have an increased effect down to the producers. there's no much more increase here on this side, a balance between collaboration and switching, what the industry expects here. Let's go to the final one, the consumer, for whom we make all the wine, for whom we produce it, to whom we sell it. And, well, so far, I think he was very strongly buffered from the effects from climate change. He enjoyed more mature wines. He enjoyed having riper wines. But what we also see is, being in a 46-degree day in Montpellier, you don't necessarily want to drink a 15 alcohol percentage red wine that is just too heavy. So what we see is, the longer and the hotter the summers, the consumers deviate to different wine styles. So they are wanting to have something fresher, something lighter, and you know what? That's exactly contrary to what we produce. So that's actually opening the gap for the producer. They don't have to keep the styles. They have to even change it towards they didn't have before. So what the retailer is telling us, we've only seen and we're expecting that, well, they're hot and long summers, the consumers changed. Suddenly, if you ask our fine wine retailer in Germany, 2018, there was a stop of sales of premium red wines. No one bought it anymore. They only wanted to have white wines and rosés and sparkling. And unfortunately, those are at a lower price, sold at a lower price. So that had a big impact on their revenue in 2018. The consumers will change their consumption pattern. If you ask a large bottler in Germany, they usually start to produce punch, that's the spiced wine, about in September, because that's when it's getting colder, the days become grayer, and consumers start to drink that. 2018, we had a summer in October. And there was no one buying, spiced wine. It was the retailers didn't ask for it. It was sitting on the shelf at the producer, and they only started to deliver it in November, 2 months later. And you know what? The consumers didn't drink all the spiced wine produced for them in November and December. It was just sitting there. And what we also see as well, they change into origins. Well, if you don't want to have an Australian strong red wine, but you rather want to have a light one, well, you buy a different origin. You might consider a nice German red wine instead of that. So this is basically the consumer deviates in another direction. What we also hear from the retailers is they tell, please, industry, use everything you can and use new technology to keep the styles you have. And this is a huge regulatory challenge, because at the moment there are strong regulations how the producers can make wine. And I think we need to open new doors in new ways for producers to actually be able to do that. And what we also ask them as well, a society that needs to invest into measures to adapt to a new challenge basically means these investments cannot be consumed at the moment. You need to take something from your economic income and not consume it, but use it to basically prepare you for what's coming. And there is, it's not a dream. Economically, climate change is really hard for us. So we should not expect that actually the consumers will have more income in the future, and retailers already expect now that this will affect the income they spend for wine. Adaptation and climate change. Well, we asked first, what did you already do and what did you plan already right now? So what's in the pipeline? And this isn't really surprising you, because that really fits with the effects people were seeing. So change in viticulture, irrigation, that's about more than half who say they are doing this or wanting to do that. We've heard about from Australia, the time window to harvest is getting smaller, so we have to change our harvest management. Enology is on number 4, but you see here, that's on the plant side, it's number 1. So that's already now in the planning. We need to change the way we produce the wines. Still not so much on the agenda is grape varieties in rootstocks, and well, we need to go somewhere else to produce the wine. Unfortunately, there are measures which would be required, but they are too expensive or they are not feasible. And number 1 here is, of course, irrigation, because, well, where does the water come from? If you look into Central Europe, we are so densely populated. Where can you build a dam to select water or to cover water over winter? It's quite different in Australia, where you have just 25 million of people and the surface of Central Europe. Well, competition for water, we cannot take water from the Rhine in summer because the Rhine is either empty or it's needed to have drinking water for the population. And I guess, if it's about who wins, water or wine, I still that the population first wants water and then wine. Not relevant at that stage is deviation to different vineyards, but we are talking about 10 years. Let's talk about 30 years, and this will be a different number. How should the wine industry producers adapt for the future? And again, we had some statements here. And number one is something we also heard from Australia this morning, and that is, well, we need to reduce our energy and our water. And actually, that's a challenge, because we've just seen that we need water to feed our wines. How can we reduce water even further? So that is a real big challenge, both on irrigation systems, but also on the root stocks, to basically still be able to produce our wines. The next ones, that's again in the same order: viticulture practices, new enology practices, changing varieties, development of new growing regions. Already 1 out of 2 says we have to think about new regions. And again, the wine industry is one of the strongest regulated in the food industry overall, because we have a positive regulation. It's not that it's regulated, you cannot do this and you cannot do this, but everything else is free. The OIV basically says there is a set of rules and you have to keep to them. If you are a wine grower in Bordeaux, the law tells you which grape varieties you can use. And Merlot is one out of them that's actually not feasible really anymore in Bordeaux. It's getting too hot for Merlot. So first, the regulator has to change the rules for you to be able to change to something else. So basically, we are in a grid. We are kind of in a fence, and the fence has to be open for us to be able to adapt and to be able to change. And that's both on, well, enology side, viticulture side, but also on regulations on maximum yields. Sustainability, the solution to how we get out of this climate change issue. And again, there's huge agreement in the industry, almost unanimous, 68% were saying, well, we need to be more sustainable. We have to contribute. We are the canary bird. We already feel the heat. So we are the first who should also react and be able to basically also try to mitigate climate change, not only in the vineyards, but helping to reduce carbon emissions. So the carbon footprint, 3 out of 4 agree that we have to reduce that. Still, 28% say, well, we can do something, but it's only a small amount to save the climate. Unfortunately, there is not so much optimism about how the consumers will react. So will the consumers follow and be able to profit and take the wine that is sustainable and choose that instead of others? And here only 56% agree, and again there is a large variation where particularly the German fine wine retail says, we are not that optimistic, the Germans are too price sensitive, whereas there is already a large agreement on Scandinavia, who did a great job in communicating environmental and sustainability. So that will be a real challenge for us, for the consumer side, to try to make them understand, well, it's your vote. You decide by buying which wine you have. And unfortunately, again, the negative economic effects of climate change, that will be something which we will realize, because our economy has to have a high share of basically covering the costs. But overall, I think it fits very nicely with what we've seen. The journey, the wine industry has been affected. It will be affected further. It will adapt, but it has to contribute to the big story by basically becoming sustainable. Thank you very much. Are there any urgent questions?
Sorry, thank you. Would you say climate change would force a concentration process in the wine industry? That means a large winery becomes bigger and bigger, and small wineries will give up the business, for example?
Thank you very much for the interesting question. I mean, we've already seen a structural change in the wine industry going on for the last decades. And we also know from profitability analysis of wine estates that there are lots still in business, but only surviving because they're on the margin. And this is like a shock. The shock will wipe out those at the margin, because if you have to invest to stay in business, you have to have the forces for that, and you have to have the budget for that. So I agree, climate change will speed up the change we already see. But I'm not sure that in 20 years' time we'll still have 100,000 hectares of wine in Germany. I wouldn't sign up for that. At least not where they are now.
Hello, thank you. You spoke about the need of having larger investments, and I was wondering if there are so many small producers who don't have access to investment, to money or whatever. Do you think we will see in the future larger companies taking over and maybe having a greater concentration of larger industries in relation to smaller producers?
That is basically mirroring the same question here, that yes, you need investments to be able to invest into new grape varieties. You have to replant your vineyards, or if you stick with the older ones, you have less income, more variability. So I agree that only those who have access to funds will be able to do it. And we've been discussing that on the European level. Again, we might be lucky if the European Union still spends half its budget on agriculture, which might not be really sensible, but only depending on achieving certain goals, that there might be a mitigation process. But I know, for instance, that in the New World, there is no public subsidy for wine whatsoever.
Thank you. And perhaps actually in contrast to that first question, might we actually see a change? Actually, it might be the larger wineries that suffer. If wine is going to become more expensive, more premium, actually it might favor smaller wineries. We might see a huge shrink in the wine market, and actually the loss of larger sort of commercial vineyards, and really a return actually to smaller, more premium vineyards, and thus actually the wine markets or wine retail becoming far more specialized and for a much smaller part of the population who can afford it.
I think that is a very wishful way of thinking about it, and I've been discussing this, that in smaller entities you might be able to be more sustainable, possibly, to be able to do different viticultural methods, but you still have to be able to communicate that. And you know, so far the share of consumers who appreciates that is still rather limited. So it's a big job of getting the mass market towards understanding that. But again, there are always two ways to it. You can try to convince them through marketing, or why don't we have regulations? If we are all interested in surviving this, and our kids should survive this, well, why can't we have stronger limitations and stronger measured how much you can emit and what you can do? Actually, for me, that's the more efficient way, because that's sometimes goes by the irrational consumer. Unfortunately, the consumer isn't very rational. He's only irrational if it's about the money, but not if it's about the rest. And again, looking into the 2008 Lehman Brothers crisis, you know, that was one of the first economic crises we had the last years. It was the last one. Well, we've seen a decline in premium wine consumption. So there are, it's pro and con, but I wouldn't be too optimistic that if it's about you have less income, that you spend more on luxury wine, not sure.
What about sustainable packaging? That's the question.
Tack så mycket för den. Thank you. If you don't mind, we have around this afternoon discussing about exactly this. I would not like to discuss it right now because we have experts, and maybe you keep the questions when those are talking. Is that okay? Thank you. Then it might be good time to hand over. I think, it's Christina's turn right now. I can't find Christina in the room. Oh, thank you. Thank you all outside. I'm not sure if they're still online. Thank you.